The air left my lungs, so fast I tasted metal. I was standing in the center of my father's formal living room, under the cold white shimmer of a 12-foot Christmas tree, while he held a silver gift tag between two fingers like it was contaminated. The room smelled like cedar garland, expensive candle wax, and the sharp citrus polish they used on the black grand piano by the window. Crystal ornaments threw fractured light across the polished oak floor. Red ribbons spilled over the Persian rug, and every face in that room was turned toward me. My father, Richard Henry Whitmore, didn't raise his voice at first. He never had to. He stood in his dark wool suit beside the marble fireplace, shoulders square, jaws set, one hand tucked into his pocket, and said, "So this is what you've been doing." Vanessa, my stepmother, leaned against the mantel with one manicured hand pressed to her collarbone, her diamond bracelet flashing in the firelight. Ethan, my half-brother, had one arm draped over the back of a leather chair, a whiskey glass hanging loose in his hand, smiling the way people smile when they think the trap is already closed. My Aunt Margaret sat ramrod straight on the cream sofa, lips thinning around the rim of her wineglass. And two family friends from the foundation board had gone perfectly still, eyes flicking between me and the envelope in my father's hand like they were watching a car skid toward black ice. My name is Caroline Elise Whitmore. I'm 34. And this is the story of how I went from being the daughter my father erased at Christmas to the woman who dismantled everything he built on lies. It happened 3 months after I realized my father had started looking at me the way wealthy men look at paperwork they no longer find useful. Before that night, I'd spent years doing what was expected of me. I served on the Whitmore Children First Foundation. I handled donor compliance. I smoothed over Ethan's laziness, Vanessa's vanity projects, and my father's habit of treating generosity like a business strategy. I knew which board members needed handwritten notes, and which ones only came if the right single malt was on the tray. I knew the names of the house staff's children, the passwords to old archive folders, and where my mother used to hide peppermint bark in the butler's pantry before she died. But on that Christmas Eve, none of that mattered. What mattered was theater. The gifts had already been distributed. A Cartier box to Vanessa, a vintage Omega to Ethan, a leather weekender for Aunt Margaret, custom cuff links for Daniel and Louise Pembroke from the foundation board, envelopes for the drivers, cashmere scarves for the house staff, even a ridiculous monogram dog bed for Vanessa's Pomeranian, Clementine. Everyone received something. Everyone except me. There wasn't even an empty box in front of my chair. I'd noticed it as soon as I sat down near the tree. A neat crescent of wrapped presents on the rug, gold paper, velvet ribbon, my father's annual performance of benevolence arranged with military precision, and then the blank patch of Persian rug directly in front of me, lit by the tree as clearly as a spotlight. Vanessa saw me notice. She lowered her lashes and took a slow sip of champagne. I knew then it wasn't an oversight. It was staging. When the last laugh faded and the rustle of tissue paper settled, my father set his glass down on the mantel with a soft click. That sound cut through the room more sharply than if he'd shouted. He picked up the silver-tagged envelope and turned toward me. "I wasn't going to do this tonight," he said, which told me immediately that he had always intended to do it tonight. "But after what I found this afternoon, I think honesty is better than pretending." Ethan muttered, "Here we go," into his drink. My father opened the envelope and withdrew several printed pages, bank records, screenshot enlargements, the kind of evidence people use when they want humiliation to feel official. "You accessed foundation reserve accounts without authorization," he said. "You moved funds through a vendor file that doesn't exist. And when I asked Nolan to review the office security logs, he found you in the records room removing documents." Aunt Margaret inhaled so sharply I heard it over the crackle of the fire. Vanessa looked at me with beautifully arranged sorrow. "Caroline," she said softly, like I had disappointed her in some intimate and exhausting way. I let my eyes move once around the room. Ethan's smirk had deepened. Daniel Pembroke had set his gift box aside and was staring at the papers. Louise had one hand over her mouth. Near the doorway, Sabrina Holt, my father's executive assistant, stood with a silver tray held perfectly level, though her knuckles had gone pale around the edge. And behind her, our head of security, Nolan Price, had the stiff posture of a man who'd been told to stand there and look useful. My father held up one of the pages. "You stole from a children's charity." He said it clearly. firmly, so no one could claim later they had misunderstood. That was the moment he wanted. The moment his daughter became a cautionary tale in front of witnesses and warm lights and imported ornaments. The moment everyone in the room would make the same silent calculation. If Richard Whitmore is willing to do this to his own daughter, she must have truly crossed a line. You always thought the rules didn't apply to you, Ethan added, pushing off the chair. Showing up late, acting like because Mom left you shares, you're untouchable. My mother, Eleanor Whitmore, had been dead for 9 years. Ethan only referred to her as Mom when he wanted something from the story. I looked at him. Interesting choice of word. He blinked. What? Untouchable, I said evenly. Keep going. Vanessa set down her flute with exaggerated care. Richard, maybe not in front of everyone. No, he said, but his eyes stayed on me. In front of everyone is exactly where this belongs. He began laying the pages across the coffee table one by one. A screenshot of a wire authorization, a badgescan log, a still frame from grainy office footage. He arranged them carefully, like knives. The fluorescent wash of the printed images looked ugly against the soft amber light of the room. I trusted you, he said. I brought you into the foundation. I defended you when people said you were too emotional for executive work. And this is how you repay me. That line almost impressed me. Too emotional. He had said it because it gave the room a role to play. It invited them to reinterpret my entire history through his lens. Not competent, sensitive, not observant, unstable, not the daughter who kept donor audits clean for 5 years. Just the difficult woman who finally cracked. Aunt Margaret shook her head, earrings trembling. At Christmas, Caroline. My God, Louise Pembroke whispered. Is this why the reserve line was short last quarter? Daniel asked. Richard, have you notified counsel? Not yet, my father said. I wanted to see whether she'd deny it first. Of course he did. That was the point of the room. The witnesses. The gifts. The missing present in front of my chair. This wasn't just about punishment. It was about making me feel small enough to either confess to something I didn't do or explode in a way that made the lie easier to believe. And if I had been the woman I was 2 years earlier, maybe it would have worked. 2 years earlier, I still believed love and evidence lived in the same house. But 3 months before that Christmas, I had found an invoice buried in a holiday donor folder that should never have been there. $8,000 to a floral design vendor we'd never used. Another $7,000 to a staging company in Rye. Then a luxury retail charge that had been coded as children's outreach event decor. When I traced the card activity, it led back to foundation funds. When I followed the vendor tax IDs, they linked to shell accounts and private deliveries. And when I quietly requested archive access to compare authorizations, I discovered someone had been using my credentials after hours. That was the day I stopped being shocked and started being useful. So while my father stood in front of the tree and accused me of theft, I felt something colder and steadier than fear settle through me. The kind of calm that comes when the storm arrives exactly on schedule. Ethan took another step toward me. Say something. I looked down at the coffee table. The false evidence. The clipped screenshots. The edited story. Then I looked at my father. Are those all the pages? I asked. The silence that followed was absolute. He frowned slightly. What? Are those all the pages, Dad? His mouth tightened. You're in no position. I'm just asking whether that's the complete file. Ethan gave a short laugh, still doing the condescending voice. Amazing. Vanessa crossed her arms, one heel tapping the floor like a metronome. Caroline, if you have any decency at all, you should admit what you did. I turned to her. Would you like to do that first? Her face changed so fast it was almost elegant. Not full panic. Not yet. Just a tiny flicker around the eyes. My father heard it too. Enough. He took a step closer. You will hand over your office keys, your badge, and your laptop before you leave this house. You will sign a statement acknowledging that you are suspended from all foundation activity pending review. And until I decide otherwise, you are no longer welcome at Whitmore House. There it was, the disinheritance ritual, dressed as governance. Aunt Margaret whispered, Richard. He didn't look away from me. If you walk out quietly, I may choose not to involve the police. That was his finishing move, not just exile. Gratitude for mercy. I could see what he expected next. Tears. Pleading. Denial. Rage. Anything messy enough to seal the image of me as the unstable daughter who ruined Christmas and stole from children. Instead, I picked up my untouched glass of mulled wine from the side table, took one slow sip, and set it back down on a silver coaster. Then I smiled. Not warmly, just enough. If that's the story you've chosen, I said calmly, then maybe we should tell all of it. Ethan straightened. My father's expression didn't change, but his shoulders did. A minute tightening, barely visible. Vanessa's fingers closed around her bracelet. I reached into my coat pocket, took out my phone, and placed it face up on the coffee table beside his papers. Please don't let anyone leave, I said. Especially Sabrina. That was when they realized I wasn't cornered. That was when the room turned. My father recovered first. Men like him always do. They survive on reflex. What exactly do you think you're doing? He asked. I unlocked my phone and tapped once. Across the room, the television above the mantel came alive, replacing the fireplace screensaver with a simple black folder menu. White text, dates, file names, clean, unemotional. Ethan's whiskey glass lowered an inch. You said honesty was better than pretending. I replied evenly. I agree. Vanessa pushed away from the mantel. Richard, turn that off. But my father didn't move. He was staring at the screen, trying to understand how far this had gone without him noticing. The first file opened onto a purchase ledger. I enlarged the itemized list until the whole room could see it. Cartier on Madison, Belford Leather Atelier, Winter Harbor Jewelers, Harcourt Fine Spirits. 15 transactions over 3 weeks. The payment source line sat at the bottom in calm. Ugly truth. Whitmore Children First Foundation corporate card. No one spoke. Then Daniel Pembroke said, very quietly, Richard. I tapped again. A second screen appeared, this time a reimbursement request bearing Vanessa's digital approval signature for holiday outreach decor. Attached to it was the invoice for her diamond tennis bracelet. Vanessa's lips parted. That is not. It is, I said. Same purchase date. Same terminal. Same card. Your bracelet was coded as educational display material. Louise made a sound in the back of her throat and stared at Vanessa's wrist, as though the diamonds had started hissing. Ethan found his voice. Okay, so what? Mislabeling an expense isn't the same as stealing funds. True, I said, scrolling with deliberate slowness, which is why that wasn't the part where I said anyone was stealing. His face went still. Third file. IT access logs. User activity. Timestamp comparisons. My credentials active in the office at 11:43 p.m. on nights. I was verifiably elsewhere. I looked at Ethan. Would you like to explain why your access badge pinged outside Terminal 4B 2 minutes before my credentials were used? His face lost color in visible increments. That's ridiculous, he snapped. Badges get passed around. Not yours, I said. You had just reported it missing in September, then conveniently found it after the clone credentials were created. He turned to my father. She hacked something. I actually laughed then, softly. No. I audited something. The silence thickened. It gathered in the room like snowfall. My father finally moved, one step toward the coffee table. You had no authority to access protected internal logs. I'm Director of Donor Compliance, I said. Or I was 10 minutes ago. Protected internal logs were my authority. Aunt Margaret sank slowly onto the sofa cushion, as if her bones had forgotten how chairs worked. I opened the next file. This one wasn't a spreadsheet. It was audio. A waveform. The room noticed it all at once. Sabrina's tray lowered by half an inch near the doorway. My father's head turned very slightly toward her, and that tiny movement told me more than anything else could have. I pressed play. First came the muffled rustle of a phone being set down. Then my father's voice, unmistakable, even distorted by speaker compression. She only needs to believe the room is against her. A second voice. Gerald Pike, our longtime outside counsel. Dry. Nasal. Precise. If she reacts, we use that. If she walks, we use abandonment. Either way, we need the proxy executed by Monday. Vanessa's voice floated in next, lazy and amused. And the gifts. My father again. Give everyone something. Make the omission obvious. She's always cared too much about symbolism. No one in the room seemed to breathe. Then Gerald said, and the reserve discrepancy? My father answered, pointed at Caroline. By the time she untangles the coding, the board will have frozen her access. The recording ended. A crystal ornament somewhere on the tree rotated and clicked softly against another. It was the only sound in the room. Vanessa moved first. That recording is illegal. That recording, I said, was preserved by someone who was tired of preparing your lies in calendar invitations. Every eye in the room went to Sabrina. She set the tray down on the console table by the door with exquisite care. She had worked for my father for 12 years. She was always immaculate, always silent, always exactly where she needed to be. Tonight she wore a charcoal-sheath dress, low black heels, and the face of a woman who had spent too long standing beside power and finally realized how replaceable silence makes you. My father's voice dropped. Sabrina! She met his eyes. You said if the auditors asked, the approvals would trace back to me. Vanessa's hand flew to her mouth. Ethan stared. Sabrina continued, her tone calm enough to frighten me a little. You told Gerald to prepare that contingency on December 12th. You thought I wasn't in the hallway when you said it. No, my father said sharply. You're confused. No, she replied. I'm done. That was the first crack. The second came when I opened a final file and turned the phone so the screen mirrored directly to the television. It was the so-called security, still Nolan Price had provided. Grainy hallway image. My coat. My profile. Me carrying a document box out of records. Then I tapped to the full footage. 6 additional minutes appeared before the clip Nolan had printed. In those 6 minutes, the box I carried was clearly labeled Foundation Archives /2018 Donor Reports. I took it into Conference Room B. Minutes later, Nolan himself entered the room, removed 3 folders from the box, and carried them toward my father's private office. Nolan's face went gray. I paused the video on a crisp frame of him looking directly into the camera with the folders in hand. You edited the footage, I said. He swallowed. Mr. Whitmore told me. I know, I said. That was mostly for the board. Daniel Pembroke rose slowly from the armchair. Richard, tell me this is not real. My father didn't answer him. He was looking at me now with something sharper than anger. Recognition. For the first time that night, he was seeing the version of me he should have been afraid of from the beginning. Actually, I said, and my voice stayed quiet, you were laundering foundation funds, falsifying governance records, and preparing to pin it on me. That was the power shift line. I felt it land. Vanessa sat down hard on the edge of the sofa, one hand braced against the cushion. Ethan started talking too fast, words tripping over themselves. This is insane. This is completely insane. Dad, say something. Tell them she manipulated this. She's been obsessed for months. You said she was unstable. I turned to Ethan. You charged a ski weekend in Aspen to a literacy initiative. His mouth closed. I looked at Vanessa. And your December bracelet was not outreach decor. Then I looked at my father. You should have given me a gift, I said. At least then this might have felt less personal. The silence that followed had weight. You could feel it settle across the room. My father finally straightened, smoothing the front of his jacket with both hands, returning to the posture he wore in negotiations and funerals. If you imagine a few miscategorized expenses and a disloyal assistant are enough to threaten me, you've misunderstood the scale of this family. There it was. Not denial. Scale. I nodded once. No. I understand it exactly. I collected my phone from the table, slipped it into my coat, and reached for the manila envelope I had left beside the tree when I came in. Inside were printed notices for Daniel and Louise Pembroke, along with copies for the other board members. Daniel took his automatically. Years of business etiquette are stronger than instinct. What is this? He asked. A notice of forensic review, I said, and an injunction petition scheduled for filing at 9 tomorrow morning. Mercer Cole LLP already has the full archive. So does the Attorney General's Charities Bureau if anything happens to the digital copies. Ethan made a strangled sound. Vanessa whispered, Richard. I turned toward the door, then paused and looked back. They thought they had ruined my name, I said, letting the words rest in the room. But they had no idea I'd spent the last 3 months learning exactly where to place the knife. I walked out before anyone remembered how to stop me. Outside, the air cut clean and cold across my face. Snow had begun to fall over the stone driveway in fine dry sheets, softening the parked cars and the clipped hedges. Behind me, through the leaded glass of Whitmore House, I could see shapes moving fast now. Ethan pacing, Vanessa rising, my father still near the fire, one dark vertical line against all that Christmas light. They thought they had trapped me with a missing gift and a public accusation. They had no idea Christmas was only the bait. The next few days moved with the strange precision of surgery. At 8:30 the following morning, Daniel Mercer met me in the conference room of Mercer Cole LLP on the 26th floor of a steel and glass building overlooking Midtown. The room smelled faintly of leather, coffee, and the lemon oil they used on the walnut table. Winter light came hard through the windows, turning every chrome edge silver. Daniel wore a navy suit so sharp it looked pressed onto him, and the patient expression of a man who billed by the hour but disliked wasting words. He had been my mother's friend before he was ever my lawyer. Not close enough to claim sentiment, close enough to know when my father crossed from arrogance into criminal strategy. He laid out the sequence in a voice so calm it made everything sound inevitable. Temporary injunction filed. Emergency board review requested. Preservation notices delivered to Whitmore Holdings, the Foundation, Nolan Price Security Consulting, and Pike Advisory. We've copied everything 3 times. If Richard tries to bully the board into delay, we petition for immediate independent control of records. I nodded. And Gerald? Daniel's mouth flattened. Gerald Pike has already requested a call. Alone. With separate counsel. I let out a breath through my nose. That's fast. Rats don't stay on decorated ships, Daniel said. By noon, the first article hadn't been written, but the whispers had started. 2 board members emailed asking for clarification. One sent a panicked voicemail saying she had never knowingly approved any irregular coding. Ethan texted me a single line. You've lost your mind. I archived it. Vanessa sent 3 paragraphs about family, privacy, and my father's blood pressure. Archived. My father sent nothing. That silence told me more than any threat could have. 3 days later, we were back in a formal room, only this time the room belonged to law instead of memory. Hartwell, Sloan, and Vickers occupied the top floors of a building on Park Avenue, the kind of firm that represented old money when old money needed clean hands. Their mediation suite looked designed to flatter people into honesty. Gleaming mahogany table, cream walls, brass lamps, leather chairs that sighed when anyone sat down. A long abstract painting in muted golds hung behind the head seat like an expensive warning. I arrived first with Daniel, our forensic accountant Irene Park, and Sabrina Holt. Sabrina had traded her usual office severity for a dove gray suit and a narrow black folder tucked to her chest. She looked composed, but I could see the pulse at the base of her throat. Irene, by contrast, looked almost cheerful. She was 51, exacting, unsentimental, and had the kind of mind that could make fraud feel boring, which is what truly frightened guilty people. Eat something, Daniel murmured as he placed a paper cup of coffee near me. I'm fine. You say that whenever you aren't. I took the coffee. The door opened 11 minutes later. My father entered first, and for the first time in my life, he looked like a man who had not slept in his own certainty. The suit was still impeccable, the watch still heavy and discreet, but his mouth had flattened at the corners, and there were half moons of fatigue under his eyes. Vanessa followed in camel wool and pearls, but the pearls looked defensive now, like armor from a softer century. Ethan came behind them, restless and red-eyed, his tie loosened badly. Gerald Pike entered last with his own attorney and avoided looking at anyone for the first full minute. That alone was almost worth the wait. No one greeted each other. We sat. The mediator, Eleanor Shaw, an elegant woman with silver hair and a voice like sharpened velvet, outlined confidentiality, procedure, and the practical consequences of non-cooperation. Then Daniel rose, buttoned his jacket, and began. He did not grandstand. He did not accuse. He simply walked the room through dates, documents, and decisions in a tone so methodical it made resistance sound childish. September 14th, he said, placing the first binder before the mediator. Whitmore Children First Foundation issues payment to Halcyon Seasonal Design in the amount of $24,680. No such approved vendor exists in Foundation records before that date. Irene slid a tabbed appendix across the table. September 17th, Daniel continued. Halcyon Seasonal Design transfers $19,000 to an account controlled by Winter Harbor Retail Holdings. Winter Harbor subsequently pays for private purchases delivered to Whitmore House and a residence in Aspen used by Ethan Whitmore. Ethan shifted in his chair. Leather creaked under him. October 2nd, Daniel said, IT Administrator Gregory Leland creates mirrored access permissions on Ms. Whitmore's foundation credentials. Same day, he receives a retention bonus from Whitmore Holdings outside normal payroll procedure. Gerald spoke without lifting his eyes. That could be unrelated. Irene answered before Daniel did. It could be, which is why we traced the metadata, internal messages, and badge scans. It wasn't. She clicked the remote. A screen at the end of the room displayed a clean timeline. Dates, amounts, badge pings, email excerpts, delivery confirmations. It looked less like argument than anatomy. November 18th, Daniel went on. Gerald Pike drafts an amendment to the Eleanor Whitmore Family Trust redistributing voting rights tied to the Class B shares intended for Caroline Whitmore. Vanessa inhaled sharply. My father remained still. Daniel placed a second document beside the first. The notary seal on this amendment belongs to Patricia Nunez, who died on November 5th. The room changed temperature. Ethan turned to Gerald, so fast his chair legs scraped. What the hell is that? Gerald's face flushed blotchy red. I was given a seal impression and told the notarization had been arranged prior. By whom? Eleanor Shaw asked calmly. Gerald hesitated. Daniel looked at him without expression. We already know the answer. Gerald swallowed. Mr. Whitmore said it was administrative. There it was. Another crack running straight through the table. My father finally spoke. Gerald, choose your words carefully. Gerald's attorney leaned toward him at once and whispered something urgent. Gerald sat back, jaw working. Daniel continued as if no one had interrupted. December 12th. Discussion recorded in Whitmore House Library regarding intentional provocation of Ms. Whitmore at the family Christmas gathering, anticipated emotional response, and execution of a board proxy freezing her access by Monday, December 27th. He didn't play the recording immediately. He let the sentence settle. Let everyone imagine it. The silence spread over the room like frost across glass. Then he played 26 seconds. That was enough. Vanessa shut her eyes. Ethan looked sick. Gerald stared at the tabletop. My father watched Daniel with the stillness of a man calculating cost in real time. December 20th, Irene said, taking over. Security footage is edited by Nolan Price to remove 6 minutes and 14 seconds, showing Mr. Price himself removing archive files, later used to support allegations against Ms. Whitmore. She clicked. The screen showed side-by-side footage. Left, the clip used against me. Right, the full feed. Identical until the cut. Then devastating. Irene placed her palms lightly on the walnut table. This is not sloppy bookkeeping, she said. This is premeditated fraud. It involves charitable funds, false attribution, forged trust instruments, altered security records, and attempted coercive governance. Vanessa found her voice in fragments. Richard told us it was temporary. He said the foundation would repay everything after year-end liquidity. He said Caroline was becoming difficult with donor restrictions, and we needed time. I looked at her, and the bracelet. Her eyes flicked down to her bare wrist. She had not worn it today. That was a gift, she said weakly. Yes, I said. I know. Ethan shoved back from the table and stood. This is insane. Everyone signed off on things. Everybody knew money moved around. Dad, tell them. Tell them this is how it works. My father turned his head toward him, slow and contemptuous. Sit down. I am not taking this for you. You already did, I said quietly. He looked at me then, and I saw for the first time the boy beneath the smugness. Not innocent, just unequipped. Ethan had floated through life on entitlement like a child on an overinflated pool raft. He genuinely believed water could not touch him if his father was nearby. Now he was starting to understand depth. The next revelation came from the person no one in that room had been prepared to fear. Sabrina opened her black folder. I'd like to add context, she said. My father's eyes narrowed. No. Eleanor Shaw raised one hand. Mr. Whitmore. Sabrina slid out a set of printed emails, neatly tabbed, and distributed copies to the mediator, Daniel, and opposing counsel. Her hands were steady now. I scheduled most of Mr. Whitmore's private meetings, she said. I also managed courier dispatches, personal deliveries, and select archive requests. On November 21st, he instructed me to send a sealed package to an apartment on East 73rd under the name Olivia Dane. Vanessa's head snapped up. Ethan looked from her to my father. Who is Olivia Dane? No one answered him. Sabrina did. Miss Dane is Mr. Whitmore's romantic companion of 14 months. Her rent, furnishings, and travel were partially paid through shell vendors that also received foundation disbursements. Vanessa went white to the lips. My father's voice came out low and dangerous. You are mistaken. Sabrina met his stare. No. I chose not to be blind anymore. This was the unexpected ally, though it was more than that. It was the betrayal he had never anticipated because he had mistaken proximity for loyalty. Sabrina had not turned because I begged her to. She turned because she saw the line he intended to shove her across when the reckoning came. And because 3 years earlier, when her daughter Lila needed emergency tuition after Sabrina's husband died, I had quietly arranged a scholarship from one of our unrestricted donor funds and never mentioned it again. People remember who treats them like human beings when powerful rooms are done using them. Vanessa stood abruptly. Her chair knocked backward with a crack. You told me Caroline was paranoid. You told me she was inventing things because she wanted control. And all this time you had an apartment for some woman in the city. Sit down, my father repeated. No. Her voice rose on the last word, brittle as broken glass. You used foundation money to dress me like a fool while you paid for her furniture. Ethan laughed once, a raw, unbelieving sound. This is unbelievable. Daniel lifted one page. For the record, Exhibit 42 contains delivery confirmations for an Italian marble dining table, 2 velvet club chairs, and a 6-foot gilt mirror built to community event design. The detail was so grotesquely specific that even Eleanor Shaw blinked. I kept my hands folded in my lap and watched the room fracture exactly the way Daniel had predicted it would. Once the first lie loses blood, the others begin to starve. Vanessa turned on Gerald. And you knew. Gerald spread his hands. I knew enough to know I needed representation. Ethan swore under his breath and reached for his phone. His attorney, a young associate brought in at the last minute, hissed, Don't text anyone. I'm calling Greg. Do not call Greg. Aunt Margaret wasn't there, but I could almost hear her horror from Greenwich. Daniel waited until the scrambling ebbed. Then he placed one hand lightly on the binder in front of him and said the line that ended all pretense. My father's voice came out low and dangerous. You are mistaken. Sabrina met his stare. No. I chose not to be blind anymore. This was the unexpected ally, though it was more than that. It was the betrayal he had never anticipated because he had mistaken proximity for loyalty. Sabrina had not turned because I begged her to. She turned because she saw the line he intended to shove her across when the reckoning came. And because 3 years earlier, when her daughter Lila needed emergency tuition after Sabrina's husband died, I had quietly arranged a scholarship from one of our unrestricted donor funds and never mentioned it again. People remember who treats them like human beings when powerful rooms are done using them. Vanessa stood abruptly. Her chair knocked backward with a crack. You told me Caroline was paranoid. You told me she was inventing things because she wanted control. And all this time you had an apartment for some woman in the city. Sit down, my father repeated. No. Her voice rose on the last word, brittle as broken glass. You used foundation money to dress me like a fool while you paid for her furniture. Ethan laughed once, a raw, unbelieving sound. This is unbelievable. Daniel lifted one page. For the record, Exhibit 42 contains delivery confirmations for an Italian marble dining table, 2 velvet club chairs, and a 6-foot gilt mirror built to community event design. The detail was so grotesquely specific that even Eleanor Shaw blinked. I kept my hands folded in my lap and watched the room fracture exactly the way Daniel had predicted it would. Once the first lie loses blood, the others begin to starve. Vanessa turned on Gerald. And you knew. Gerald spread his hands. I knew enough to know I needed representation. Ethan swore under his breath and reached for his phone. His attorney, a young associate brought in at the last minute, hissed, Don't text anyone. I'm calling Greg. Do not call Greg. Aunt Margaret wasn't there, but I could almost hear her horror from Greenwich. Daniel waited until the scrambling ebbed. Then he placed one hand lightly on the binder in front of him and said the line that ended all pretense. Cooperate now, or we proceed with civil actions, criminal referrals, trust recovery claims, charitable fraud reporting, and emergency press disclosure if required to preserve donor confidence. He said it the way some people say the weather. My father leaned back slowly. You think public scandal helps you? I think sunlight helps me, I replied. He looked at me then, really looked. For a moment the room fell away, and we were back in every private conversation where he had underestimated me because he confused softness with lack of appetite. You planned this, he said. Yes. How long? Long enough. He gave one small, humorless smile. You always were your mother's daughter. That landed deeper than he intended. My mother had not been meek. She had been elegant, disciplined, and impossible to bully once she recognized coercion. The family liked to rewrite her as gentle because the dead are easier to manage when you sand down the sharp edges. But I remembered her better than that. I remembered the stillness she wore when she was angry, the way she would stop polishing a sentence until only truth remained. Daniel slid a document toward opposing counsel. Here are the terms. It was not mercy. It was structure. Immediate resignation of Richard Whitmore as acting chair of the foundation and suspension from all fiduciary authority, pending full audit. Restitution of misappropriated funds with interest. Transfer of all Eleanor Whitmore Trust voting rights back to their original beneficiary. Formal written statement to the board retracting allegations against me. Separate accounting of all shell vendors. Surrender of digital devices relevant to the investigation. Independent administrator, installed for 6 months. Non-disparagement clause. Nolan Price to provide sworn testimony. Gerald Pike to withdraw from any representation tied to the trust amendment and preserve all communications. Vanessa stared at the pages as if the words might rearrange into a better life. Ethan whispered, Dad, do not sign that. My father didn't answer him. Instead, he asked me, what if I refuse? I let a second pass. Then another. Deliberate slowness is crueler than shouting when the other person is already fraying. Then the Attorney General sees the full file by 5, I said. The board gets every audio clip. Donors learn their holiday outreach funded Aspen and East 73rd. And the forged amendment becomes a matter of public record. He looked at Daniel. You would destroy the family. Daniel's expression didn't move. No. You handled that portion yourself. Another silence. Heavy. Formal. The kind that belongs to contracts and verdicts. Ethan began again, frantic now. This can't all go on me. I did what you said. The vendor thing was your idea. You told me the reserve line could absorb it until Q1. Vanessa turned toward him in disbelief. You idiot! He rounded on her. Oh, don't start. You practically redecorated yourself on charity money. I did what your father approved. Gerald muttered. This is exactly why I advised against family informality. I almost smiled. Next time, I said, looking directly at my father, make sure they're not working for both sides. That was when he understood that Sabrina wasn't my only quiet ally. Irene had been reviewing public filings for 6 weeks. Daniel had the injunction ready before Christmas dinner began. 2 board members had already agreed to emergency reconstitution if needed. Even Gregory Leland, the IT administrator, had preserved old system logs after Daniel's firm made him aware he was being set up as expendable. The long game wasn't a flourish. It was infrastructure. My father pressed his fingertips together and stared at the documents. I wanted you to see them, I said softly. He glanced up. The invoices, the badge scans, the recording, all of it. I wanted you to see what it looked like when a story finally belonged to the right person. Vanessa sat down again in small jerking movements. Ethan raked a hand through his hair and looked about 12 years old. Gerald asked his attorney for water. Sabrina sat with her hands folded over the closed black folder and did not look at anyone. The mediator cleared her throat. Mr. Whitmore, the opportunity to resolve this discreetly is narrowing. My father picked up the pen. He signed first with the controlled, angry precision of a man carving his initials into stone. Vanessa signed next, though she made a small desperate noise before the second page, as if she had only just now understood that signatures travel farther than tears. Ethan argued twice more before his attorney all but put the pen in his hand. Gerald signed the preservation acknowledgement without speaking. The sound of paper turning was almost tender. When it was finished, Daniel gathered the executed copies into one stack. Irene initialed the evidence index. Eleanor Shaw confirmed next steps in her smooth, measured voice. Chairs scraped. Phones reappeared. Bodies remembered movement. My father remained seated. As I rose, he said, "Caroline." I stopped but did not turn immediately. When I did, he looked older than 63. Not ruined, not broken, just reduced to the mortal dimensions hidden beneath money and posture. "This is not over." "No," I said. "It's just accurate now." I put on my coat. The wool settled over my shoulders like a verdict. Vanessa avoided my eyes. Ethan stared at the table. Gerald slipped out with his attorney. Sabrina stood beside Daniel, no longer at anyone's command. At the door, I looked back once. My father had always loved saying that Christmas revealed character. Usually over brandy. Usually while other people thanked him for gifts he had chosen to be seen giving. So I gave the line back to him. "You were right," I said quietly. "Christmas does reveal character." Then I left him in the room where everyone had finally seen his. 6 months later, I woke in a place with sunlight instead of surveillance. My apartment sat on the top floor of a converted warehouse in Tribeca, with pale brick walls, tall factory windows, and a narrow balcony just large enough for 2 chairs and a stubborn rosemary plant. Every morning, light poured across the hardwood floors in long gold strips and warmed the matte black railing outside my bedroom. The first morning I drank coffee there without checking my phone for legal updates, I almost didn't recognize the sensation. It felt like setting down a bag I'd forgotten I was carrying. That summer morning, the city sounded softened by height and distance. Tires hissed below on wet pavement from an overnight rain. Someone summer was practicing scales on a piano. My mug was warm between my palms. The coffee smelled dark and clean. And for the first time in years, the coming day belonged entirely to me. People like to imagine justice as one loud moment. A courtroom slam. A public apology. Someone crying in designer clothes. The truth is quieter. Justice, when it finally came for my family, arrived as paperwork, board votes, account freezes, whispered withdrawals, and invitations that stopped arriving. Richard Whitmore resigned from 3 boards before he could be removed from a 4th. The official language was always for personal reasons or to focus on private matters, but everyone in our world understood translation. Donors do not enjoy discovering that toy drive money helped furnish a second life on the Upper East Side. His name remained on building plaques because stone is slower than shame, but in rooms that mattered, people began saying Richard, with that thin pause wealthy society reserves for men whose polish no longer conceals the rot underneath. Vanessa did not leave him immediately. That would have been too dignified and too late. First she stayed long enough to be photographed twice more beside him, smiling with the strained brightness of someone holding broken porcelain together with both hands. Then she moved into a furnished apartment on Sutton Place and filed for separation using language about betrayal, humiliation, and financial misrepresentation that might have sounded more powerful if she hadn't spent years benefiting from the same machinery. The bracelet, incidentally, was surrendered as part of the restitution review. I heard she asked whether she could keep it as a personal gift. The answer was no. Ethan lost his Vice President of Strategic Development title because it turned out strategy is harder when you can't expense your weekends and invoke your father's last name as a business plan. He tried launching a hospitality startup with 2 friends from college and 1 very glossy pitch deck. Investors, unfortunately, dislike founders with unresolved fraud-adjacent testimony. By the end of spring, he was consulting in the vaguest possible sense, which appeared to involve posting gym selfies at 2 p.m. and using the word stealth a lot. Aunt Margaret became the tragic opera singer of the whole thing. She told everyone at first that she'd been completely blindsided, as though she hadn't spent years attending charity galas where line items somehow shrank when Vanessa wanted a new floral wall. Then the story changed. Richard had become impossible. Vanessa was vulgar. Ethan had always been spoiled. In every version, Aunt Margaret had somehow been seated too far from the controls to notice the plane was on fire. Society women nodded sympathetically over lunch at St. Ambrius, and then quietly stopped inviting her to chair anything important. Gerald Pike fared worse professionally. He was never criminally charged, but But disciplinary review has a way of draining prestige from a man faster than scandal alone. His clients began leaving in small, embarrassed batches. Then his firm restructured. Then his name disappeared from the letterhead. The last time Daniel mentioned him, he called Gerald, an expensive lesson in what happens when legal arrogance meets metadata. Nolan Price settled early and noisily. Security, men always look invincible until their own timestamps become evidence. The messages started almost immediately after the mediation, then changed tone as the months went on. First came threats. You are making a catastrophic mistake. You have no idea what public litigation will do. Call me before this goes any further. Then came indignation. Families survive things like this privately. You've embarrassed people who don't deserve it. Your mother would be horrified. That last one I read twice before archiving, not because it hurt, but because it told me how little they still understood her. After indignation came nostalgia, which is the cruelest disguise entitlement wears. From Vanessa, I still remember the Christmas you were 10 and insisted on wrapping the staff gifts yourself. I never wanted it to be like this. From Ethan at 1:14 a.m. I know things got out of hand, but the family isn't the same. From my father, finally, after 11 weeks of silence, we should speak. Not through lawyers. As father and daughter. I archived that one too. Then, one drizzly Tuesday in May, I received the message that almost made me laugh into my cappuccino. I miss you. The house is very quiet now. No apology. No admission. Just a complaint dressed as longing. I put the phone face down and went back to reviewing a client file, because that was the other thing that emerged from the wreckage. A life built from skills I hadn't understood were mine until I needed them. 3 months after the mediation, Daniel referred me my first independent client, a mid-size arts nonprofit with a charismatic founder, chaotic internal controls, and a board that kept confusing loyalty with governance. I found the missing approvals in 4 days. Then came a family office in Connecticut, then a scholarship fund in Philadelphia, then a healthcare foundation whose executive director had been paying a nephew's consulting firm for community engagement that consisted mostly of invoices and imagination. What I had learned inside my own father's trap turned out to be commercially useful. I started a firm called Whitmore and Holt Governance Advisory because Sabrina refused to remain a footnote in the story and because she had earned something better than a seat by the door with a tray in her hands. We took an office in Nomad with frosted glass walls, pale ash desks, and a conference room lined in acoustic panels the color of storm clouds. It wasn't grand. It was clean, efficient, honest, and ours. Sabrina ran operations with surgical grace. I handled investigations, donor controls, and family governance disputes. Irene Park came on as a retained forensic advisor and terrified half our clients into excellent record-keeping. Our first year was booked by August. People came to us because we understood something they didn't teach in compliance seminars. Fraud inside families doesn't begin with greed. It begins with permission. One person decides the rules are flexible. Another decides love means silence. A third decides discomfort is ruder than deceit. And by the time anyone says stop, the floor has been rotting underneath everyone for years. I was not alone in that understanding. One of the few relationships that survived the whole collapse was the one I never expected to keep, Daniel Mercer. We had always known each other in the formal grammar of adults who share history and restraint. But after the case, our conversations acquired the ease of people who had walked through a fire and discovered neither needed performance. He called on Fridays sometimes from the back of a car, tie loosened, just to say, "Do not let Sabrina buy that absurd espresso machine without making her show you the numbers." And Sabrina, hearing only her own name, would call back from the doorway, "The numbers are excellent, Daniel." Then there were the smaller grace notes. Lunches with Louise Pembroke, who confessed over tomato soup in a bright white cafe near Bryant Park that she had always liked me but never realized how much she'd confused my composure for consent. A note from Lila Holt after her first semester at Columbia, thanking me not for the scholarship years ago, which she had only recently learned about, but for showing my mother what courage looks like in heels. And once in June, a karma update delivered so casually it felt almost obscene. Sabrina leaned against my office door, holding a takeout salad and looking far too pleased with herself. "You won't believe who I just saw at probate court," she said. I glanced up from my laptop. "If this ends with Ethan pretending to understand estate law, I'm busy." She smiled, Close. Vanessa. In cream linen. No pearls. Arguing with her own attorney in the hallway because she thought her temporary support package included the Southampton membership. I sat back slowly. Did it? No. That tiny word tasted better than it should have. Another time, Daniel called while I was on the balcony watering the rosemary. Have you heard, he said, that your father's Upper East Side apartment has been vacated? Olivia Dane finally developed standards. I don't know about standards, he replied dryly, but I do know she retained excellent counsel. I laughed then, a real laugh, the kind that rises without checking whether it's safe. Poor Richard. Daniel said. I wouldn't overinvest in pity. I didn't. The strangest update came from Harper Sloane, Vanessa's daughter from her first marriage. At Christmas, Harper had been in the corner of the living room in a green silk dress, half filming the gift exchange for social media and half pretending not to watch me disappear in real time. She had learned her mother's habits of stylish detachment early. During the weeks after the mediation, I assumed she would vanish with the rest. Instead, she sent me a message in late spring. I owe you lunch if you'll take it. I stared at it for a full minute before answering. We met at a cafe in the West Village with bentwood chairs, brass hooks, and tiny marble tables barely large enough for 2 iced teas. Harper arrived in wide-leg trousers, no makeup, and an expression I recognized immediately, the face of someone who has discovered the family mythology does not survive daylight. I was awful to you, she said after we ordered. Yes, I know. She looked down at her hands. My mother told me you were cold, that you judged everyone, that you were always trying to make her feel like an outsider. I tore a corner off the bread on the plate between us. And now, she gave a sad little smile. Now I know she says outsider whenever someone notices what she's doing. We became, not close exactly, but real with each other. Sometimes that is better. She told me what it was like growing up around Vanessa's hunger for status. I told her what it was like mistaking endurance for loyalty. Once, after too much wine and a long evening, she admitted she had deleted 2 draft posts defending Vanessa when the affair news surfaced because, in her words, for the first time in my life, I didn't want to help polish a lie. I respected her for that. By autumn, she was sending me listings for small gallery openings and terrible men on dating apps, and I was reminding her to read contracts before signing anything with her mother attached. It wasn't a bond one could have predicted. It was simply proof that sometimes truth leaves behind cleaner relationships than blood ever did.